Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today, we're going to be looking at education.
Oh, yeah, a big one.
It is a big one.
For sure.
And we are going to be taking a look at a 1980s episode of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose.
Yes.
And this one is about education.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give everybody a little background,
Yes, sir.
Milton Friedman was a very well-known economist.
Right.
I guess kind of a libertarian.
Free markets.
Free markets.
Yeah.
Individual liberty.
Yep.
And so he had this show called Free to Choose, and this is one of the episodes from that.
It's interesting how these things come back around. Like all the things that they were debating in the 80s are still things that we're debating now.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting, too, because he starts out this episode by contrasting two high schoolers.
All right.
One is Hyde Park High School in Boston.
Okay.
And it shows, some of the problems that they were having there.
Which were,
I think under-resourced.
Yeah.
They were having some security issues.
not a lot of parent power in that school.
Right. And then he
Yeah.
contrasts that with Weston High School,
Okay.
which is in a wealthy suburb of Boston.
Right.
And it's like this beautiful campus.
Yeah, the kids are all, doing science projects
Yeah.
and going to the,
Yeah.
the football game. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's this really stark contrast that he's setting up.
But he's setting up this idea of control.
Right.
Like, who has control over the education?
And so this is kind of where I want to pause and ask our listeners to think about, the schools in their local communities.
Right.
Do you see any of these same kinds of disparities? Are there schools that are really well funded?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in more affluent areas,
Right.
and then other schools that are struggling.
That are under-resourced.
Yeah. And how does that make you feel?
Yeah. One of the things that Friedman points out is this idea that, we used to have this, kind of idyllic vision of the one-room schoolhouse in Vermont,
Right. Yeah.
where parents had a lot of control
Right.
over their kids' education.
Yeah.
And so how much control do you feel like you have over your kids' education now?
Right. And that's where he's going with this. He wants to set up this idea that parents should have more control over their kids' education.
Right.
And he thinks that the public school system, as it exists now, doesn't really allow for that.
Right.
So what are some of the criticisms that he has of the public school system?
Well, he thinks that the public school system is too bureaucratic.
Right.
That it's not really set up to meet the needs of individual students.
Right.
And that it's basically failing a lot of kids.
Yeah, and I think especially low-income families.
Yeah, and so he sees that as a real
problem.
Yeah.
Because he says, we're spending all this taxpayer money on this system that's not really working.
Right.
And he sees that as a form of injustice.
Right.
Because the people who are most affected by it are the people who can least afford to, send their kids to private schools or find other alternatives.
Exactly. And so his solution to this is a voucher system.
Right.
And essentially what a voucher system would do is it would give parents money that they could then use to send their child to any school.
Any school that they want.
Whether it's public or private.
Public-private charter.
Right. So he's saying that would create competition among schools.
Competition is good.
Right. And that would then lead to
better quality.
Better quality.
More innovation.
Right. And more choices for parents.
More choices for everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
of course.
This is a very controversial idea.
Extremely controversial.
And so in the episode, he talks to a variety of people.
He does.
Who have different perspectives on this.
Yes. He talks to teachers.
Right.
Union reps. He talks to other economists. Education experts, school administrators, all sorts of people.
And they have a lot of concerns about this idea of a voucher system.
Yeah, they do.
So what are some of those concerns that they raise?
Well, one of the big concerns is that private schools would just cherry pick the best students.
Right.
The kids who are already doing well.
Right.
The kids who come from families that are, supportive of their education.
Right.
And they would leave the public schools to deal with all the kids who are, maybe struggling. Maybe they have learning disabilities or behavioral problems or whatever. And so That's what they call cream skimming.
Right.
Right.
They're skimming off the cream of the crop and leaving the public schools with, everybody else.
Right.
And they're concerned that that would actually make the inequalities in the system even worse.
Right, because then you would have this kind of two-tiered system where the private schools are getting better and better and the public schools are
struggling even more.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because, Friedman's whole thing is about choice.
And freedom.
Right. But his critics are saying, well, is it really choice?
If only certain people have the means
to
actually exercise that choice.
Right.
If you can't afford to send your kid to a private school, then what good is a voucher to you?
Right. And it's not just about money.
No.
Right. I mean, it's also about
information. Do you know what schools are out there? Do you know how to evaluate them?
Yeah.
Do you have the time to, go visit them and talk to the teachers and all that kind of stuff?
Right. And so I think...
So it's not as simple as just, throwing money at the problem and saying, okay, now everybody has choice.
Exactly.
It's more complicated than that.
So there's a lot to unpack here.
There is.
And we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to delve into some more of the arguments for and against this voucher system.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back.
And another concern they brought up, is that this could actually lead to more segregation in the schools.
Yeah. If people are able to choose schools based on...
like their religious beliefs.
Right.
Or the racial makeup of the school or the socioeconomic, background of the students.
Right.
So, that's a real worry, is that this could actually make things more segregated.
Right. And so it's not just about, the kids in the schools. It's also about...
The community.
Right. Right. Like, how would this impact,
how would it affect...
Property values.
Right. Transportation.
How about, access to extracurricular activities.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Yeah. And then, another thing that they brought up is this idea that, are parents really equipped to make these decisions?
To make informed decisions about education.
About their kids' education.
Right.
Do they have the expertise, the knowledge to really know what's best for their kids?
Right.
And they're saying, well, look, we have professional educators who have, spent years studying this.
Yeah.
And they're the ones
who should be making these decisions.
And I think, it goes back to that point about information.
Right.
Like, do parents have access to
the right information?
The right information to be able to make these choices.
Yeah. And are they, being given unbiased information?
Right.
Is it, are they being influenced by, marketing campaigns or political agendas or whatever?
Yeah.
So it's a complicated issue.
So it's not just about choice. It's also about making sure that people have the information they need to make.
Informed choices.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So, and then, another thing that they talked about is poverty.
Right.
How does that factor into all this?
Right.
Because a lot of the problems that we see in education are really rooted in poverty.
Yeah, like kids who are coming to school hungry.
Right.
Kids who
are,
dealing with trauma at home.
Kids who don't have stable housing.
All those kinds of things.
Out of that.
And so they're saying, a voucher system is not going to fix those problems.
Right.
It's not going to magically make poverty go away.
So are we just putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem?
Right. Is it just a way to kind of, make ourselves feel better?
Avoid the real issue.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so
that's a big concern.
So they're not saying that choice is bad. They're just saying that we need to be careful.
We need to be mindful
about how we implement it.
Of the unintended consequences.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so Friedman also in this episode points to some specific examples of programs that he thinks are doing things right.
Okay.
One of them is the Inner City Scholarship Fund in New York.
All right.
And this is a program that provides scholarships to low-income students.
To attend private schools.
Right.
And he says that these schools
are doing a great job.
Yeah. The kids are.
The kids are thriving.
They're
outperforming their peers.
In public schools.
Yeah.
And he says this is proof
that choice works.
Choice works.
Yeah. Okay.
And he also talks about Harlem Prep.
Okay.
Which was a storefront school that was started in the 60s.
Okay.
And it was very successful.
Okay.
They had, high graduation rates.
Yeah.
The kids were going on to college. But then it was eventually absorbed into the public school system.
Okay.
And then it declined.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he uses that as an example of how bureaucracy can stifle innovation.
Stifle innovation.
Yeah.
So he's saying that,
when you have these kind of independent schools that are free from
the constraints of the bureaucracy,
right,
they can be more innovative, they can be more responsive to the needs of students.
To the needs of students and to the needs of parents.
Right.
Right.
And so, he sees that as
a positive thing.
As a positive thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, of course, he also acknowledges that
there have been
cases where choice hasn't worked out so well.
Right.
And one of the examples that he gives is
the Alum Rock experiment.
The Alum Rock experiment in California. And this was a program.
Yeah, back in the 70s.
Yeah.
They tried a voucher system.
Yeah. And it didn't.
And it didn't really work out.
Really work out the way they hoped.
The way they hoped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think, what's interesting about that is that
it shows that it's not a simple solution.
Right. Just because you give people choice.
Just because you give people vouchers.
Doesn't mean that.
Doesn't mean that.
Everything's going to be great.
Everything's going to be magically fixed.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, that's an important caveat to keep in mind as we're thinking about these issues.
Because it's not a black and white issue. It's very nuanced.
Yeah. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about K through 12. But Friedman also has some thoughts on
higher education.
Yeah. And he's not a big fan.
He is not.
Of state-funded colleges and universities.
Yes, he's not.
So why is that?
Well, he thinks that they're basically a subsidy for the wealthy.
Okay.
He says that, lower income taxpayers are essentially paying for the education of people who are going to go on to earn higher incomes.
Right.
So he sees that as a form of regressive taxation.
So he's saying it's basically a transfer of wealth.
Right, from the poor.
From the poor.
To the rich.
To the rich.
Wow.
Yeah, and so he thinks that
we should move away from that system.
Okay.
And instead have a system of loans.
Okay.
Where students are responsible for
their own education.
For their own education.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think, that's a very controversial idea.
Very controversial.
But it's one that's worth considering.
It's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, what are the arguments against that?
Well, one of the big arguments against that is that loans create a barrier for low-income students.
Especially if you're already struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
The idea of taking on tens of thousands of dollars of debt
can be very daunting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might deter you from even going to college in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, Friedman's whole thing is about
individual responsibility.
Individual responsibility.
Yeah.
But
his critics are saying.
But there are also societal benefits to education.
Right. Yeah.
An educated workforce.
Benefits everybody.
Benefits everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, the government has a role to play.
Right.
In making sure that
everybody has access.
Everybody has access.
Has access to education.
To education.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, because, he talks about how the government shouldn't be subsidizing things that
primarily benefit
the wealthy. The wealthy.
Yeah.
But his critics would say, well,
hold on a second.
Yeah.
The government subsidizes all sorts of things that benefit corporations.
I benefit wealthy individuals.
Tax breaks, subsidies for, oil companies, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So why are we picking on education?
All right.
Why is that the one that we're saying, that's too much government involvement?
Right.
Yeah. So it's a complicated issue. So it's not just about, individual responsibility. It's also about
societal responsibility. Yeah.
And I think, this is where we can start to think about how these ideas play out.
In our own community.
Right?
So, what's the landscape of higher education like in your community?
Are there a mix of public and private?
Yeah. Do you have community colleges?
Community colleges, yeah.
Do you have?
State universities?
State universities, yeah.
Private universities.
And how affordable are they?
Right.
Yeah. Are there scholarships available?
Yeah.
For low-income students?
Are there, programs to help
people?
People pay for college?
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that Friedman talks about is that he thinks that students should be more responsible for paying for their own education.
Right.
But he also says that...
But he also...
think that
everybody should go to college.
Everybody needs to go to college.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting point because we have this...
We have this kind of assumption in our society.
Yeah, that everybody has to go to college.
That everybody has to go to college.
To be successful.
To be successful.
And Friedman's saying...
And he's saying, well...
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe there are other paths to success.
Like trade schools.
Like trade schools.
Apprenticeships.
Apprenticeships, yeah. You know.
And so I think, you know, that's something we're thinking about.
Yeah. What are the options in your community?
Yeah.
For people who don't want to go to college or who can't afford to go to college.
Right.
You know,
are there opportunities for them?
To get the skills they need.
To get the skills they need.
Yeah.
To get good jobs.
To have a good life. Yeah. And I think, you know, this is where we can start to think about how all of these ideas that we've been talking about connect back
to our own lives.
To our own lives.
To our own communities.
To our own communities.
Yeah.
Right? So let's think about vouchers for a moment.
Okay.
One of the things that Friedman talks about is parental control.
Right.
He thinks that parents
are the best judges of their kids' needs.
More control over their kids' education.
Yeah.
But as we've been discussing...
that raises some equity issues.
Equity issues.
Yeah, like are we really empowering all parents equally?
Right.
Or are we just empowering the parents who are already privileged and well-informed?
Yeah. So think about the parents in your community.
Mm-hmm.
Do they all have equal access
to information?
To information about schools.
About the different options that are available.
Would they be able to navigate
a
choice system?
A complicated choice system.
Right. Sure.
Especially if they
face language barriers.
Or
if they have limited time.
Lack transportation.
Or if they, just don't have the resources to, do all the research and the legwork that's involved.
So it's not just about giving people choice. It's also about making sure that they have the support.
The support they need. To actually make use of that choice.
To make informed choices.
Yeah.
And then, of course...
there's the issue of...
funding. Right.
Yeah.
If we're going to have a voucher system, how do we make sure...
that all of
the schools are adequately funded?
Right. Because
if public schools are losing students to private schools, that means they're losing funding.
Right.
So how do we make sure...
And so Friedman's argument is that competition will
force schools to become more efficient.
Right. But his critics worry
that it could lead to a race to the bottom where schools are cutting corners to save money.
And so then they're not providing a quality education.
The quality education.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think, this is a really important
it's a really important
point to consider.
Consideration.
Because it's not just about money. Yeah. It's also about
the quality.
The quality of the education.
Of the education.
Right.
Yeah. And
so I think, as we're thinking about all these issues, it's important to acknowledge the complexity.
Yeah. Right? It's not a simple issue.
It's not a simple issue.
There's no easy answers.
There's no easy answers.
And so
we need to be
careful
about embracing simple solutions.
Simplistic solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about
vouchers. We've talked about choice. We've talked about the role of government in education.
Yeah.
All sorts of things.
And so now I want to bring it back.
Yeah.
To that.
Think and act locally.
Theme. Yeah.
So what does all of this mean?
For you.
For you in your community.
Yeah. So what are the strengths and weaknesses
of your local school system?
Of your local schools.
Right.
What are the demographics?
Yeah.
What are the socioeconomic factors?
Socioeconomic factors at play.
Right. And most importantly, what can you do?
What can you do to get involved?
To make a difference. Yeah.
So are there
school board meetings?
School board meetings you can attend.
That you can attend.
Yeah.
Are there local organizations that are working, that are advocating
on these issues? Education reform?
Right.
Are there parent groups that are
that are,
trying to improve their schools?
And I think, it can feel overwhelming. To think about tackling
these big systemic issues. But remember that even small actions
can
make a difference.
Can have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
So start by having conversations.
Talking to your friends.
With your friends and family.
Yeah.
Your neighbors.
Your neighbors.
Share what you've learned.
Share what you've learned from this deep dive.
From this deep dive.
Right.
Yeah.
Go
to a school board meeting.
Volunteer at a local school.
Volunteer at a local school.
Right.
Yeah.
Get involved.
Get involved in your community. And I think, one of the things that
really struck me about this episode was how Friedman uses these very vivid examples to illustrate his points.
Like the two high schools.
Right.
And it's such a powerful...
Yeah, it's such a powerful...
Reminder that
these abstract debates about policy have very real consequences for people's lives.
For students' lives.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think he does a really good job.
He does a really good job.
Yeah.
Of using storytelling.
Of making these ideas.
To make these complex ideas.
Relatable.
Right.
And whether you agree with him or not.
I think it's important to
at least engage with his ideas.
And
think about, what they mean.
What they mean.
For you.
For your
community.
Yeah.
And so I think, one of the things that he's really trying to do in this episode is to get people to think differently.
Is to challenge the status quo.
Right. And I think, he
does a good job of that.
Yeah. Even if you disagree with his conclusions, I think it's important to at least consider
his argument. And I think, one of the things that he's really advocating for
is for people to live their education.
Proactive.
Yeah.
Right.
To be more engaged in the process.
Yeah. And I think that's something
we can all agree on.
Yeah. Right?
Regardless of our political beliefs.
Or our economic philosophy or whatever.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, education is not one size fits all. Different students have different needs. Different communities have different needs.
Different communities have different resources, different challenges.
And so we need to be mindful.
Of that.
As we're
designing
our education systems. Yeah.
Second, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Just because something has always been done a certain way
doesn't mean it's the best way. Yeah.
And I think, Friedman is a really good example of that.
He's a great example of somebody who was not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom and to say, hey, maybe we need to rethink how we're doing things.
And I think,
and I think
that's a really
valuable
perspective to have. Right.
Yeah.
And finally, remember that you have a voice.
Right.
Get involved in your community. Attend those school board meetings.
Yeah. Talk to your elected officials.
Support
organizations. Organizations that are working to improve education.
Yeah.
And I think, the future of education.
Depends on engaged citizens. Who are willing to think critically. Ask tough
questions. And demand better.
For our kids. So we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. And inspired you. To take action. So thanks for joining us. Until next time. Keep learning. Keep questioning. And keep diving deep. But we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about vouchers.
We've talked about choice. We've talked about the role of government in education, all sorts of things.
And so now I want to bring it back
to
Think and Act Locally.
Think and Act Locally theme. Yeah.
So what does all of this mean for you in your community? Right. So what are the strengths
and weaknesses
of your local school system? Right. What are the demographics? What are the socioeconomic factors at play? Right. And most importantly, what can you do to get involved to make a difference?
Yeah.
So are there school board meetings you can attend?
Yeah.
Are there local organizations that are working?
They're advocating for education reform.
On these issues, right? Are there parent groups?
Yeah. that are trying to improve their schools.
Trying to improve their schools.
Yeah.
And I think it can feel overwhelming.
It can feel overwhelming.
To think about tackling these big issues.
These big systemic issues.
Right, but remember.
But remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Yeah, so start by talking to your friends.
With your friends and family, your neighbors, share what you've learned from this deep dive.
You know, go to a school board meeting.
Volunteer at a local school.
Volunteer at a local school.
Right.
Right? Get involved in your community.
In your community.
And I think one of the things that
really struck me about this episode was how Friedman uses these very vivid examples to illustrate his points, like the two high schools, and it's such a powerful reminder that these abstract debates about policy have very real consequences for people's lives.
For students' lives.
Yeah.
Right. And I think he does a really good job of using storytelling to make these complex ideas relatable.
Relatable, yeah.
And whether you agree with him or not, I think it's important to at least engage with his ideas and think about what they mean for you, for your community.
For your community, yeah.
And so I think one of the things that he's really trying to do in this episode is to get people to think differently, to challenge the status quo.
To challenge the status quo. And I think he does a good job of that. Even if you disagree with his conclusions, I think it's important to at least consider
his arguments.
His arguments.
And I think one of the things that he's really advocating for is for people to be more proactive.
To take ownership of their education.
Right. To be more engaged in the process. And I think that's something we can all agree on.
That's something we can all agree on.
Right.
Yeah, regardless of our political beliefs or our economic philosophy or whatever.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
I want to leave you with a few key takeaways.
All right.
First, education is not one size fits at all. Different students have different needs.
Yeah.
Different communities have different needs.
Different communities have different resources, different challenges.
Right. And so we need to be mindful of that as we're designing our education systems.
Yeah.
Second, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way. And I think, Friedman is a really good example of that.
He's a great example of somebody who is not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom and to say, hey, maybe we need to rethink how we're doing things.
And I think that's a really valuable perspective to have.
It's a really valuable perspective, yeah.
And finally, remember that you have a voice. Get involved in your community. Attend those school board meetings.
Yeah. Talk to your elected officials, support organizations that are working to improve education.
Right. And I think the future of education depends on engaged citizens like you who are willing to
think critically, ask tough questions, and demand better for our kids.
So we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and inspired you to take action. Thanks for joining us.
Until
next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.